There is this scene in Silent Hill 3 that speaks to me. This scene in particular is when you're in Brookhaven Hospital during the Otherworld sequence where the player happens to find themselves in the storeroom. There lies nothing but a massive mirror that looms across the room. Heather can't do anything other than just stare at the mirror and watch as this seemingly mundane and innocent room slowly manipulates its presence to be one of pure, utter terror, as it becomes filled with blood that spreads everywhere. The scariest part, the blood consumes Heather, albeit on the other side of her reflection, but yet it stands there frozen as if it is lost to time, powerless and vulnerable. Unable to do anything but stand there and watch her, forcing Heather to watch the horror that not only surrounds her, but look at what she has become, foreshadowing the events that will conspire and unfold. I believe this scene is a metaphor for change. A prominent symbolism can be inferred when one associates itself with a mirror, symbolizing this notion of someone reflecting upon their inner self, seeking for truth. No words are spoken. The presentation here speaks for itself. This is Heather Mason, the main protagonist of Silent Hill 3. Heather is a 17-year-old teenage girl that, for the most part, is entirely alone and living a seemingly normal life. The introduction throws the player into the terrors of an amusement park, showing monsters that may familiarize veterans of the Silent Hill series, or maybe the catalyst in a beginner's understanding of what they conceive horror as. The atmosphere is moody, dark, and violent. It's as if this amusement park that should be nothing but normal is anything but that. The player progresses further along the roller coaster tracks to where they are greeted with an active ride that kills Heather on the spot, waking up the poor girl from a dreadful nightmare. Alone in a restaurant with no other presence but herself, looking out the window reflects this emitting sunlight on her. All Heather could comment is the strength to muster what a nightmare it was, and look at the pendant that acts as a necklace. It's a perfect scene that doesn't need to say much about Heather, but rather shows us the type of character she is right off the bat. A normal girl is thrown into a very surreal experience that evokes a valid emotion, a response that any person would have, summarizing the horrors of Silent Hill 3 as a whole.
What a nightmare.
For a recap, Heather is the adopted daughter of Harry Mason, the main protagonist of Silent Hill. Before Heather, there was Cheryl, her previous identity for when she was a 7-year-old child. Harry and her 17 years ago were off to visit the hometown of Silent Hill as a vacation. It wasn't until Harry succumbs to a car accident, landing himself in the foggy town of Silent Hill. Harry loses Cheryl and urgently seeks out her as he wanders aimlessly in this barren wasteland that is filled with nothing but the macabre of monsters that dominate the town. Long story short, Harry uncovers the revelation that Cheryl is a lost soul that is split in half from her other half, Alessa Gillespie. Alessa had a very dark, violent, traumatic, and abusive childhood. Alessa was bullied, beaten, tortured, and set on fire as a child. Her extreme suffering were caused by her mother's cult, the Order, for the sake of rebirthing her god. With the forced impregnation of God, Alessa's pregnancy goes awry and is a failure as she is set ablaze, resulting in the process of her soul being split in half, which would become Cheryl. Harry unknowingly starts the ascension of the birth of God through manipulation by Delalia Gillespie, recombining her two souls to rebirth the Incubator. Harry enters a duel with the Incubator, killing it to save his daughter and put an end to everything. Harry kills the false god and is granted the reincarnation of Alessa and Cheryl, Heather Mason. Because of these previous events, this will transpire and kick off the plot of Silent Hill 3. The purpose of Heather is to have the chance of living a normal life, one that her previous life could never have. A chance of rewriting the trauma and pain that poor Alessa had to suffer with this newly found lifestyle Heather is granted. However, this all comes to an end when Heather is confronted by Douglas, a detective who is in search of her to discuss her birth. Rightfully concerned and creeped out by a nonsensical question a random bystander would ask, Heather flees and roams the mall to get home to her father. In doing so, Heather confronts Claudia, the main antagonist that has the intent to seek out the rebirth of a god that grants a world that is built with an eternal paradise. This is only possible through Heather, as she is predestined in achieving this task, as she is impregnated with God that Claudia speaks of. Not only that, but Claudia is filled with vengeance and vows revenge for what Harry did all those years ago in stopping the rebirth of God in Silent Hill.
Remember me, and your true self as well. Also, that which you must become. The one who will lead us to paradise with blood-stained hands.
Because of this, Heather goes on a prolonged journey where she ventures through the horrors of each location that is filled with monsters, visual imagery that is explicit, memos that give explanations for the disturbing lore that accompanies the atmosphere, and much more as the player progresses. Silent Hill 3 indulges in this horror with many elements that are found previously in the games prior to this one. But I feel like this game really solidifies much of the psychological nature that engrosses this and makes it quite profound with this entry. There's something so alluring that had me on my toes throughout my entire playthrough. Starting from the very beginning in the bathroom while in the mall, to the end where Heather kills God. So let's talk about it, shall we? One thing that stood out to me is the atmosphere of Silent Hill 3. Each location is quite confined and linear. We see this in the mall, subway, underpass, office building, Brookhaven Hospital, amusement park, and chapel. Locations that are very claustrophobic at times, with the hallways being stretched out with this walk that feels like an eternity when roaming. It's tight, where there isn't much room to breathe, forcing you to either go in fight or flight with the monsters that impede your progress. Always needing to check your map to remember where you are, and be certain of where to go next. Of course, the monsters are what the players would take first notice of when thinking of the horror elements that are presented mostly throughout the gameplay, which you wouldn't be wrong to be fixated on consistently, as they are the most prominent feature. But when you take away the monsters, there is an even more threatening aura that isn't them in particular, but it's the loneliness of the environments Heather visits. There are instances in the gameplay where Heather would not have to fight anything, but rather be confined in the dark and silent atmosphere that creates a very unsettling vibe. Most of these places would normally be populated, alive with this vibrance that is made up of the people that converse with each other, or wander around doing their day-to-day tasks, but it's anything but that, creating this illusion that is a false sense of safety. It's a very cathartic feeling that is absolutely fascinating yet terrifying to me. These are environments that are seen as normal by the public, spaces that are where you go to do whatever your needs obligate you to do. These are places that I myself or you have visited while growing up, and to see that innocence, or rather lack of it, is truly terrifying. It's as if this game understands the fears any normal person would have if they are put in a situation like Heather is in. Putting in these monsters that are unfathomable to understand and that have us fear the unknown is one thing, but stripping that normalcy that we have grown accustomed to is another. Most of the time, there's not much but just white noise as you walk aimlessly through these large spectacles and small enclosed claustrophobic environments that shouldn't impose a threatening aura, but you can't shake that feeling that there is something there. It's as if someone or something is watching you. You keep turning your head around the corner to validate these feelings to make sure you aren't losing your mind. It's quiet. It's isolating. It's exhausting. All these feelings of concern feel so real that it hurts on such a personal level. It reminds me of the times when I was young in my childhood. I would walk around the mall with my mom, holding hand in hand together to make sure not to let go in fear of getting lost, or worst case scenario, kidnapped by someone. You feel small, insignificant, and vulnerable. Genuine concerns that I didn't think about as a kid, but imagine that my mom did raising her child. Not wanting her child missing and lost in this massive behemoth of a building where they are scared of being alone. The mall portion stood out to me the most because of how real these fears are that any human being would have. And it doesn't just have to be the mall. It could also be the subway with the looming dread of walking alone in these empty hallways with no one but yourself. Scared of walking too close to the train tracks and falling over. The labyrinth of the underpass that while may not see most individuals ever in such a location, still encompasses this frustration of feeling lost as you go through this maze-like environment that warns you look hesitantly for the exit, yet you can't seem to find it no matter how hard you try. The loss of a loved one that passes away unexpectedly that has you at a loss for words, unable to process the traumatic experience that any unfortunate soul has to be put through. Your world feels like it's crashing down, and everything around you is devoid of life, leaving nothing but you, and only yourself to endure this grieving alone.
No! No! No!
Traveling in an open road that features no oncoming traffic on the road nor any form of life that revolves around it on the sidewalks, as a pedestrian would walk by. It's foggy and it's unclear where to go next. An amusement park that is derived from its singular purpose of making you have a fun time with friends and family, left with a vast darkness that has no sign of life, only emptiness in its lines to the rides that should feature people screaming for their life, defeating the purpose of going if all alone, going to church to have a talk with God and listen to fellowship, wanting this peace of mind on that Sunday morning to reap yourself of your sins and be purified. However, this becomes tormented and twisted with this corrupt belief that defies any sense of morale and rather focuses on the selfish desire in one's conquest, focusing on their own needs rather than thinking of how others feel, once again creating this loss of innocence.
Alyssa, don't you want happiness? Have you become blind to all the hopeless suffering in the world? We all need God's salvation.
Listen, suffering is a fact of life. Either you learn how to deal with that or you go under.
All these locations that should be filled with this sense of life, but the only thing alive is the horror itself, forcing Heather to face these horrors on her own. But it's because of this that makes Heather rather a very strong-willed independent character that feels human.
Heather, I need to speak with you. My name is Douglas Cartland. I'm a detective.
A detective? Really? Well, nice talking to you.
Even though she may give off the impression of embodying this walking, edgy 2000s stereotype, is due in part to the changes any pubescent teenager who reeks of hormones would understandably go through. Contrary to popular opinion, I believe it's this teenage angst and rebellion that is manifested to be turned into resilience and perception.
That figures. He's a pretty sneaky guy.
Don't talk about my dad like that!
Sorry. I apologize. Please.
Heather is under constant pressure that leaves her with no other choice but to adapt to the environment that sees her utilize combat with firearms and melee weapons and problem solving to proceed to the next area. Even though it's bound to the gameplay, making it very obvious that it's mandatory, doesn't excuse the sense of realism that unfolds with Heather's commentary. She feels genuinely concerned about the surroundings that have her in disgust with the environment, the monsters, and even the major characters at times. A reaction any sane person would emit with this unordinary dilemma she is in.
Is this a dream? It's gotta be.
One scene that solidifies this is her encounter with her father's death. It's quite a shock to the player that doesn't pull any punches nor has second thoughts about presenting this emotionally devastating outcome. It's tragic. You feel nothing but empathy. Harry is the protagonist we played as prior to the first game. We've seen his journey firsthand from the very beginning to the very end. You've grown to be acquainted with Harry as he is the normal, everyday man, just like any of us, on an ambitious mission that is fueled with determination in finding his daughter. It's a roller coaster that is filled with nothing but emotion. So when you see that character who seems like nothing can stop him be brutally murdered in his apartment all alone, you feel bewildered. You feel empty. These feelings that overwhelm Heather. It's a scene that dramatically shifts Heather's character, as she changes from a pubescent girl who wanted to hold on to that innocence, at least what's left of it, to being forced into adulthood through trauma and tragedy. It's an unfair situation that leaves her feeling emotionally frustrated, not knowing what to do next, resolving for some sort of resolution. This result is due in part to Harry stopping the Order, the religious organization 17 years ago. This fuels Claudia with vengeance and wants to make not only Harry, but Heather suffer the consequences. Giving Heather this rightful hatred that she has is enough to become determined to kill Claudia.
I don't care about God or paradise. If that's what she believes, then fine. But she won't get away with what she did. When I find her, I'll kill her myself.
While tragic, it's crucial in Heather's development in evolving her character, which shows her humanity above all, making a moral decision on her behalf that expresses maturity. This emotion has an everlasting damaging effect on her, but yet she perseveres by making these decisions with thought before making the action. Heather never once relies on help from anyone, only upon herself, except for Douglas giving her a ride to Silent Hill. But even then, she is committed to walking on foot, rather than bearing the burden of letting him help, knowing he can get himself killed. This change is not only in Heather's character development, but it's also expressed in the subtle yet explicit themes that the player may not come to find upon the first playthrough, but upon consecutive playthroughs after. There are many of them, but the ones that stood out to me prominently were the sexual themes that point out abuse, abortion, violation, forced pregnancy, and sex. At first glance, it's one of the more underlying themes that may not be as apparent because of the focus on the psychological nature of the gameplay, but the more you deep dive into these visual imageries and symbolism, it becomes quite obvious that it's one of the more outspoken commentaries that is shown rather than fed to the player. That commentary is the fear of being a female. Many occurrences of this can be seen through the symbolism of the monsters. Most of the monsters are shown to be detailed in sexual undertones that express much of the female and male genitalia. The Numbody's appearance features a striking resemblance to sperm. The split worm looks alarmingly similar to that of a vaginal cavity, and the worm's face references the fetus. It could also be a reference to the phallic nature of sperm, as during the boss it moves in and out of tunnels upon being attacked by Heather. Scrambling to safety while movement may be an allusion to sexual intercourse. The slurper could symbolize Heather's possible fear of rapists and stalkers. Heather wears a miniskirt, adding to her vulnerability in the possible sexual theming when a slurper knocks her down and climbs on top of her. Furthermore, sexual objectification is a strong one that exposes most of Heather's body sexually. During the Brookhaven Hospital section, there's a small side quest that the player can embark on where you come to find that Heather has a stalker. It isn't revealed who this stalker is per se, as it's left ambiguous in this mystery since he is never revealed physically speaking, but I believe that the lack of appearance of Heather's stalker makes the fear much more credible and real. Her stalker has an obsession with collecting mundane items as seen on the wall, alluding to these possessions as romantic gestures to Heather, a twisted sign of affection. His phone call later on is very unsettling, as his message is rather cryptic, that leaves Heather uncertain of what to make of what he is implicating to her. This obsession feels very sadistic in the pronunciation of the voice of the stalker when speaking to Heather, giving this uncomfortable vibe that makes this guy a walking red flag.
Okay, thanks. Happy birthday, dear, who are you? Happy birthday to you. Happy 31st birthday.
Is this Leonard?
That's the murderer's name, not my name. I'm not your beloved Stanley either. He's underground now. His new name is Number 7. But don't worry about that now. It's time to celebrate your birthday.
You've got me mistaken for someone else. Today's not my...
I'm not mistaken. Today is your 24th birthday.
The player may notice that blood plays a pivotal role in the game. Blood is an evident feature throughout the gameplay. It is expressed everywhere as visual imagery that is made to be violent and explicit. Most of this blood is associated with monsters that are violent yet sexual. The Closer, Insane Cancer, Missionary, and Scrapper are shown to be grand in this spectacle. Large in size is this physical prowess that towers over Heather that makes her out to be small in scale. The design is filled with weapons that are sharp and has this heavy mass. It could be symbolic to the abuse that Lessa received in her childhood as she was a victim of bullying from her classmates, subjected to a forced pregnancy from her own mother, and confined to a hospital bed and resuscitating her back to health in hopes of keeping her alive to give birth to another god. These sexual connotations appear evidently, as you can see that most of these monsters could allude to the symbolism of dilation and cutterage, an often used method of miscarriage or abortion. Blood isn't only expressed in the form of an enemy, but it's also notable throughout the environment. The first time Heather enters the office building to find the room with the bathtub corrupting the room with blood, resulting in her getting a headache and cramps as her body collapses to the floor. The otherworld version of Brookhaven Hospital is filled to the brim with blood that covers the environment as Heather navigates through the tight and deadly corridors to further progress. The best example of this is when Heather is collecting the tarot cards in the chapel, roaming through each floor to see a nauseating and grotesque scene of the blood that litters the atmosphere. Upon meeting Claudia, Heather suffers from the menstrual cycle of preconceived childbirth, resulting in cramps and aches in her body. A recurring element that plagues Heather is foreshadowed by these reactions from the pain she's in as shown earlier on. Sex is a very taboo discussion in culture, one that is expressed in a mature fashion which takes a pubescent child that has the mature mentality to physically and mentally be prepared to understand the concept. Silent Hill 3 takes this and manipulates it to not only scare the player, but to convey the disturbing, everlasting effects it has on a female. It creates this dissonance from something that should be seen as beautiful, to this horrible and disgusting commentary that invokes this perceptive outlook on the player. Further diving into these attributes that are associated with the sexual themes that are presented here made me rethink from a different perspective how downright terrifying it is to be a woman. Heather is shown to be subjected to not having much control, but rather a lack of due to by the hand of others to make that choice for her for their selfish gains. From the beginning, she is prophesied to give birth to a god against her own will, having no say on how she feels ethically or morally, only in one that is in anger. Claudia expresses this as a revelation, an act of God to purify the world of sin and rebuild an eternal paradise. Douglas, before coming to a close relationship as friends, seeks out Heather for his own purpose, making amends for his dead son that he lost tragically and hoping to make up for that by helping Heather.
You remind me of my son.
You said nobody was going to cry for you.
Dead people don't cry. Stupid kid got himself shot robbing a bank.
Vincent, while not elaborated, is implied that he wants to kill Heather and Claudia to manifest this other world that he has a disgusting fascination with.
Are you talking about the monsters?
Monsters? They look like monsters to you? Oh no. Don't worry. It's just a joke.
The characters in Silent Hill 3 are shown to see Heather as this sort of vessel, a savior to their salvation that they obsessively desire. It's scary to see how far this obsession goes when Heather occurs on the Order's religious practices, glamorizing Heather as this deity that will answer all their prayers and solve the problem of mankind's damnation, putting her on a pedestal to idolize her when she never asked for any of this nor has any desire to further this interest of theirs. That's when the battle of two bloodstained ideologies clash together, these being Heather and Claudia's perspective of life. They are understandably both victims of abuse at the hand of their respective parents, Dahlia for Alessa, Leonard for Claudia.
You hated your father, didn't you? I saw the way he hit you. kicked you and made you cry. The memory of his cruelty is forever burned into my mind.
Victims suffered tremendous amounts of pain and suffering that would drive anyone to the brink of no return. Of course, I could never account for how that trauma must have felt personally, but I could only imagine how it would affect a person's mentality very significantly. Claudia confines in her pain by believing that no human being should ever have to go through such suffering as she did, believing that the world needs to be cleansed and pured from their sins to be reborn. Hence the intuition of prophesizing that the rebirth of a god filled with hatred would make it more empathetic to realize the pain others undergo to have mercy on their souls. However, this is determined by one person, based on their own beliefs that is one of selfish intent that has blood on her hands. Heather, on the other hand, is the complete opposite, as she believes that no human could be born with pure hatred, and that doing so would bring about a catalyst to the world that is without pain. There has to be a world with pain and suffering because that is how we grow as humans. It's not fair, but so isn't life. Heather would know this because of the pain her previous lives have gone through. Alessa suffered the tragedy with her fate being nothing but pain and sorrow to allow her other half, Cheryl, to live a life without the pain. A noble sacrifice that was an act of selflessness rather than selfishness. But in doing so, ironically brought that pain and suffering upon others with the events of Silent Hill. Heather realizes this, and decides to endure this trauma and tragedy by facing it head on, rather than letting it consume her. It develops her character into a mature and perceptive one as opposed to Claudia, who loathes and bathes in this painful and traumatic experience. For once, Heather finally claims control by disrupting the ritual of the rebirth of the god by taking the pendant, forcefully vomiting the fetus to then have Claudia consume it and birth God herself. The god is shown to be rather incomplete, with its body shown to be in decay, lacking skin and bones. An allusion to a premature or violent birth that wasn't successful, resulting in this false god that isn't what Claudia perceived with the vision she had in mind. It lacks this grand spectacle and glorious image, instead rather shrieks in pain as if it is begging to end its suffering. Heather commits to her goal of successfully avenging her father by killing God, putting an end to Claudia's nightmare. However, with the damage that is done, one must ask themselves, was it worth it? What did it cost? For Heather, it was everything. We watch as Heather breaks down crying, helplessly emotionally vulnerable, and grieves for her father. It's a heartfelt moment where the player can't help but feel sorry for Heather. It's as if you are accompanying a friend who is crying with you and you just sit there and watch. All you could do is be by their side and listen. Nevertheless, Heather collects her thoughts and composes herself and keeps moving forward, accepting herself for who she is by embracing Cheryl.
Heather, did
You
you...
don't have to call me that. I'm not hiding anymore.
Want me to use your real name? What was it again?
Cheryl. The name my father gave me.
Silent Hill 3 is truly an experience that I never thought I'd ever witness, but I'm glad I did. It's a disturbing horror game that does that exactly, through its gameplay design, mature themes, characters, narrative, and so much more. I would even say that this entry is my favorite Silent Hill compared to the others in the series. There is something different here that sets it apart, which makes it special. It's very in-depth with its vision of embracing that horror element in such a unique approach that I've never seen any other horror done before. It scares the player in very insightful and thought-provoking ways, rather than the typical gimmick we have seen done before. Heather Mason is truly one of the best horror protagonists I have seen, and I wish we could explore much more of her character. No wonder people keep coming back to that foggy town of Silent Hill. There's always something bringing us back, and it'll be waiting for you.
You gonna let your hair color go back too?
I don't know. Don't you think blondes have more fun?